come in. For people who are blind and cannot see, and for those who can see but are blind to the people around them, come in. For people who move slowly because of accident, illness, or disability, and for those who move too fast to be aware of the world in which they live, come in. For people who are deaf and cannot hear, and for those who can hear but ignore the cries of others, come in. For people who learn slowly, for people who learn in different ways, and for people who learn quickly and easily, but often choose ignorance, come in. For people who have chronic illnesses for which there is no cure or relief, and for people who live in the unholy fear of developing chronic illness, come in, come. Let us hold and be held and behold one another. Anyone have muscle memory? I feel like this time of year, something's afoot. Something's afoot. We got some homeschoolers maybe here, but what time of year is this again? We talked about it last week. What's that? Beginning of school. Everyone's excited with that silence. I love it. That's great. The enthusiasm's kicked in. So we are at the beginning of school, but did you know how many years of school are there? Like the number ones? You're close. It's a little more. 2, what is it? 12. You're getting there. You two were on the way. It was great. 12. How many of you, well, but then you have like these other like 5 or 6 before, like you're a baby, and then you might be like you stay home with a parent or daycare or preschool, all these words. Well, you start with 1. You should start with 1 when you're younger, right? And then you just get to 18. But how many of the folks here are more than 12th grade? Anyone older than 12th grade? Oh my gosh, they're surrounding us. This is wild. Well, did you know that there are many, many people who choose to learn beyond the 12th grade, and some who don't even pay to learn after the 12th grade. They just say, you know what? I don't need no school to teach me all there is to learn about life. How many of you would identify as a lifelong learner, someone who wants to learn throughout life in all the different ways? And it's nice because after a while, you break free of the 40-hour, 35-hour school week, transition into the 40-hour, 35-hour work week or more, but your learning can continue. And so this time of year, I'm really excited to think about how we are all going back for another year of learning. But I also realize that some of us learn really differently. How many of you think of yourself, we said some of the words up there, how many of you think of yourselves as like a fast learner? You learn things pretty quick. You can raise your hand. Okay, how many of you like need a little extra time, read a little bit extra, get a little extra? How many of you are like, there's this word like visual learners, it's easy to see, or some of you just love words. You just can look at a lot of words and you're like, that's where I'm happiest. How many of you learn best in groups? Or how many of you fear groups and you're like, just let me do it by myself? Any individual learners? Okay. There's a lot of dynamics here in any relationships I'm noticing. How many of you feel like you've got a lot to learn this year? Anyone? Yeah, stated or unstated. How many of you are working on your multiplication tables? Anyone starting on those? Pretty soon. Nice. Or math people? Any math people here? How many people would run away from math if it had legs? Yes, I see. Well, did you know that there's so many ways for us to learn and for us to live, and that there's not one best way or even a better way, like a hierarchy, like height, that there's taller people and shorter people, that there's some reason it's better to learn this way versus this way. In fact, all these ways that we learn have little gifts to offer our community and to your friends at school or in homeschool and such. And so one of the ways we remember this is because of the values that we hold as Unitarian Universalists. And we have to remember these and hold on to them as we go into this year ahead. So I actually have a little gift, and I'm wondering if someone could would you like to open the Wonder Box? Let's see what's in there. Oh my gosh, what are those? Let's see. Oh, they're like a little, what are these called? Keychains. Oh, and look at that pretty little CCI logo. And on the back, oh my gosh, let me see. Oh, it's some of the new UUA values that were just approved this summer. Let's see if we want to learn more about these topics this year, along with multiplication and all those other things. Let's see here. Justice. That one sounds good. Equity. That's a big one. In a second. Generosity. Oh my gosh. There's some really good ones on the back of here, but one of the greatest things is right in the middle is love, because love is at the heart of our community and of our faith as Unitarian Universalists. So we're going to make sure we give one to everyone who is going into school this year, and those who aren't going into school but have chosen to be lifelong learners.
This is called Speaking So All Can Hear. So when Nick asked me to contribute to this service in July, which some of you may or may not know is Disability Awareness Week, I found it particularly apt, as I not only have cerebral palsy, or CP, but am a mental health counselor. Advocating for accessibility is not only central to my personal values, but professional as well. Accessibility is a broad term and can mean many things. It's not surprising, then, that it was not until I got to the third entry in Webster's online dictionary that I found what I was looking for. Capable of being understood or appreciated. This definition suits my purpose this morning for a very simple reason. Any resource, in this case of UCCI, compassion, empathy, understanding, and a sense of community, for example, are only as powerful and transformative as each member, friend, or newcomer's ability to see, experience, and participate in them. Put another way, this is for you, Louise. No matter how beautiful a melody, the music only serves to transform and inspire in so much as it is able to be heard. How then do we as individuals surely, but particularly as an intentional community of shared principles and common values, make sure that everyone has access to our precious gifts? We listen and allow our compassion and understanding to drive intentional and loving action. Perhaps it's as simple as using a microphone despite our misgivings. Surely I'm loud enough already. Perhaps it's offering a quiet space to chat for someone who craves connection but is sensory avoidant. The accommodations we offer are an extension of love and community, will be as varied and as wonderful as all the people we are fortunate to welcome here. Whatever is needed, I'm confident we as a community can accept the challenge, not because it is simple, but because accommodation is simply another way to invite another in and show compassion. And while we are beautifully diverse and celebrate those differences, searching for ways to share compassion is in our DNA. Accommodation is just another way to show it.
We have one reading today, and it's sort of a series of excerpts from a much longer article titled, "Can We Please Stop Calling Able-Bodied People Tabs?" by Crippled Scholar. Temporarily able-bodied. In an effort to build understanding around the issues of disabled people, we chose to remind people that we are a group they can join at any time, and most crucially, are very likely to join. It is described as this, quote, AB is an abbreviation for able-bodied. TAB is a slightly more to the point abbreviation, meaning temporarily able-bodied. TAB refers to the inevitable, namely that most of us will face disability at some point in our lives. Whether it comes sooner or later varies depending upon one's circumstances. end quote. Disability is still deeply stigmatized. People actively fear becoming like us. I have a friend who often states that they would prefer to die young than ever become dependent in their old age. Not all currently able-bodied people will become disabled either temporarily or permanently. Lori Toby Edison and Debbie Notkin say, quote, "The term temporarily able-bodied is oversimplified. Disability is not inevitable. Only two things are always temporary: life and youth. Everything else is conditional, contextual, and or statistical." Definitions of ability, disability are exceedingly complex. Even definitions of aging are less obvious than they might immediately appear, end quote. Ability is not always temporary. In a culture that tries not to admit that people die at all and is especially resistant to admitting that young people ever die, it's important to remember that death and old age are not synonymous. I most frequently hear tab used as an inevitable description. As already pointed out, this is simply not true. As Notkin and Edison point out, people have difficulty coming to terms with mortality and morality. Disability, though not always deadly, is an extension of that fear. People do not view acquired disability calmly or dispassionately. They quite often fear it. For a term like tab to be effective at including others in understanding, they must first understand that disability is not a fate worse than death. Unfortunately, understanding disability and the barriers disabled people face will take more than a term that is at its best misleading and at worst could fan flames of fear, because telling someone who fears disability that they are likely to become disabled is more likely to cause backlash than open channels of communication. When I was 7, my mother enrolled me in my first acting class at First Stage Theater Academy. As its website suggests, First Stage is the nation's largest high-impact theater training program for young people. What began with a dozen one-hour Saturday lessons in the fall turned into a decade-plus journey of theater classes, often year-round with some breaks and with summer intensives. And I loved those classes. And I loved First Stage as a child and adolescent. I was immersed in all types of classes, from stage combat to Shakespeare, and from musical theater to improv. The friendships and memories from First Stage carry with me even now. One of the things that these literally thousands of hours of theater training fostered in me, not to mention the learning I gained at the public arts-based middle and high schools I attended in Milwaukee, was an appreciation for the relationship between artist and audience. I'm of the belief that it requires both artist and audience to create art, but I also see the blurred lines between the two, where one is both artist and audience, and vice versa. We both create and experience the creation. We are, as Shakespeare said, all merely players on this shared stage, this world, which is our home. This dynamic, this creative tension between artist and audience, was for me an early education in empathy. Having empathy, consciously or unconsciously, for what exists not only on the stage of creativity, but for who and what lies beyond the fourth wall. That there may be a part of this awesome human experience that I cannot fully comprehend, that is, that of the audience, aided in fostering skills that have proven invaluable in my adult life. Empathy, like art, is a skill worthy of practice, of repetition, of discipline. And the line between art and life is perhaps thinner than we care to imagine. After all, the motto of First Stage Theater Academy is life skills through stage skills. One of the stage and life skills I learned early on was about the power and importance of the diaphragm. Anyone have a favorite anatomical function? No? It's a great icebreaker. I've used it not. For me, I grew up learning more about the diaphragm and how it works than perhaps any other internal organ. It's underrated. It's underrated. In theater, I learned about and practiced what is called diaphragmatic breathing. According to the University of Mississippi Medical Center, they describe the diaphragm and correlated breathing exercises in this way, and I especially enjoy and point you towards this first sentence. Quote, "The diaphragm is the most important muscle for inspiration. It is a large dome-shaped muscle that is situated beneath your lungs. Diaphragmatic breathing is taught to help improve the efficiency of your breathing and help strengthen the diaphragm. People often get into a habit of tightening their chest, shoulders when they breathe, instead of relaxing those muscles and filling the low belly up with air. This technique will help improve your overall breath support and aid in the improvement of your vocal quality." End quote. We're not going to practice this today, but the result of these techniques and years of repetition reinforced my already enthusiastic personality with an ability to modulate my volume and voice with consistency and ease, so much so that I was often told I was being too loud, like in a theater production or the classroom or everywhere. And as such, I would often be the one who would not need to get a microphone for larger productions in high school, for example, where, as you might imagine, the arts budget of a public school was limited, to say the least. It was sort of a badge of pride, though, to say, no, I don't need a microphone. I've been doing my diaphragmatic breathing exercises. The audience can hear me without one. And years later, as speaking on the stage transformed to preaching from the pulpit, I changed how I thought about this whole badge of honor regarding using a microphone. And at the same time, I was noticing more and more people, especially those who speak publicly, ministers and non-ministers alike, ask two sometimes rhetorical questions. Quote, "Do I need a microphone?" And "Can you hear me?" Now, these two questions rest at the intersection of the artist and the audience, of the stage and of life itself, of what exists within the four walls of our own experience and that which may exist beyond the fourth wall. You see, the questions, "Do I need a microphone?" and "Can you hear me?" are two very different questions, but two that are often expressed together. One, "Do I need a microphone?" while asked to the audience, is typically framed in an objective or rhetorical manner. This is evident in its related structure that forgoes questions like, "I don't need a microphone. You can hear me." Thankfully, the second question returns the authority of accommodation to the audience who is asked, "Can you hear me?" Excuse me. The challenge of this question, though, is that it is cast out beyond the artist, beyond the fourth wall, into the audience, good, but into the great mystery of subjectivity. The question is rarely asked, though, to a single subject. Rather, it is to a number of individuals, sometimes a few or a dozen, dozens, hundreds, or more. "Can you hear me?" It asks the question as if the response will be given in choral unity, in pitch perfect precision, and in a word, objectively. If there was just one person, "Can you hear me?" would be appropriate. Other options would include a voting or consensus model in the room of, "Can you all hear me?" which is at least acknowledging multiplicity. But alas, the challenge of this question is that for one who may wish to say, no, it is hard to hear. It is difficult to answer that way because in many regards, it's hard to raise your hand when someone asks, who among you can't hear? And this is when often the result is silence, is unity and objectivity in two forms. The first, the audience has become singular and the answer objective. And or two, the individual or individuals who would dissent from the collective would do so at the cost of potentially becoming objectified. In that moment, empathy or of subjective difference becomes absent with only sympathy, not empathy, sympathy left in its wake. This 1,009 word leadoff to my sermon today is the foundation for what I believe is a critical and central issue that faces communities that seek to be welcoming and inclusive. Accessibility and disability justice are not just matters of asking, do I need a microphone or can you hear me? But rather whether this community, let alone the world, will be a place where our voices individually and collectively will be amplified, whether ours will be a world where all can both hear and be heard, see and be seen, where we can hold and be held and behold one another in our wholeness, indeed, in our sacred subjectivity. Here's the thing, it's so easy to get caught up in our own little world or our stage, if you will. I know that when I am looking at the world from my position of privilege and responsibility, of authority and accountability, I can forget too often who I am. And not only that, but whose I am. There's a difference there. It is important to ask oneself before we take the stage each morning, both who am I? What are my values? What am I bringing to this stage today? And also, whose am I? Who am I accountable to? Who might be out there listening just beyond the fourth wall? Because in that dual orientation, I believe we can remember that we are both artist and audience, both givers and receivers of love and life, or the lack thereof. I believe this congregation is one that earnestly seeks to be welcoming and inclusive of people of all backgrounds and experiences. I have seen your hearts, and like mine, they radiate love and hope for a better future for our world. But as I spoke about last week, our welcome and inclusion efforts are jeopardized by the complexities of the waters in which we swim and the beautiful nuance of our lives that exists like the iceberg almost entirely below the water's surface. And so we here, artists of this on this stage of life, must attempt to not lose awareness of our wholeness and our subjectivity as a congregation of individuals, of interdependent siblings in our planetary family. We do a pretty good job, I think, or have been for many years, seeking to make visible the structural oppressions that exist within and beyond the walls of our community. As a congregation in recent years, we've been especially concerned with the rise in white supremacy and racialized violence, the proliferation of transphobic legislation, and the stripping of reproductive healthcare autonomy. Not to mention the increasingly fragile global ecosystem we are stewards of and must protect at all costs. As Unitarian Universalists, we are living into what we set as a congregational priority in 2019 to, quote, work to overcome injustice in all its forms. One form of injustice I'd like for us to pay extra attention to is one that can often be overlooked, namely that of accessibility and disability justice. For as I mentioned earlier, to be able to access life, to be able to experience community and the joys and sorrows thereof, one must first be seen and heard, and the community must provide space for that to happen. This goes beyond, as I said, the importance of utilizing microphones and other assistive technologies when possible. Truly, it requires us to go beyond the binary of those who live with disabilities and those who do not. In our reading this morning, the author of the reading, who goes by Crippled Scholar, lays out the well-meaning liberal sensitivity to individuals with and without disabilities, specifically through the use of the terms disabled on the one hand and temporarily able-bodied on the other. This identification comes from a good place to remind those who are not living with a disability, those with some form of privilege in this world that is shaped around their experience, to be mindful that life circumstances change, and thus remembering that everything is transient or temporary, and it will foster, in doing so, more empathy and accessibility for our disabled siblings in the world. But as they suggest, the author succinctly, the use of the binary identity masks, sort of erases, the underlying fear many individuals have, or many individuals without disability may likely hold. Responding to another article that names the correlating fear of disability and mortality, Cripple Scholar writes, quote, in a culture that tries not to admit that people die at all and is especially resistant to admitting that young people ever die, it's important to remember that death and old age are not synonymous. The author goes on, for a term like temporarily able-bodied to be effective at including others in understanding, they must first understand that disability is not a fate worse than death. Let me say it again. We must understand and remind ourselves and each other that, quote, disability is not a fate worse than death. Indeed, by equating the two or even drawing similar values between them, it further alienates those with disabilities of birth or that they have acquired throughout life, and for those of us without these characteristics. The distinction makes it harder to cultivate empathy for the one or two or many among us who would benefit from an accommodation, such as a microphone or a larger print order of service, or a low sensory option for coffee hour. Instead, we cultivate some combination of sympathy, which can take the form of pity or perhaps shame or internalized ableism or even anger or frustration by the mere possible presence of difference in regards to our physical, social, emotional, and psychological needs. I remember once attending a lecture by a prominent civil rights activist of the 1960s, who at the time was probably in his mid-80s. I believe, and perhaps it was always the case, but at that moment in his life, he spoke quite softly. And I recall this memory anytime I think about disability justice and intersectional justice work. I remember someone asked from the audience, asking if he could speak a little louder. And his response, while not cruel, was crisp and quick, in which he said, "Why don't you listen louder?" And in an odd reaction of the audience, everyone either nodded or even applauded. And perhaps it was because it was, in a way, a profound thing, like we all need to listen more closely to what is happening in the world today. But part of me was curious about what that civil rights leader thought about what it means to create a space where all can join in the movement for justice and liberation. Alas, there is some projection in what the intention and impact of that encounter was, but it underscores the fact that sometimes there is natural righteousness, or at least hierarchical significance, that places some justice issues higher than others. In this case, of racial justice and voting rights rising above the unity of the activist and the audience that may, if fostered, yield a more holistic and sustainable peace in the world. I'm stuck with this notion of UUCCI being a community where all can hear and be heard. We can inspire one another to break down the barriers between us, many of which we put up ourselves or gather like scars throughout life. But I could imagine that the mission we have named for ourselves, our purpose here as a congregation, which is to celebrate love and work for justice, not to mention the vision we hope to make real together as we become, quote, a beacon for diverse religious thought and courageous action, will call on us all to slow down and practice our breathing, to slow down and consider our delivery, to slow down and ensure we are all ready to receive a word of truth and meaning, of inspiration and transformation from the artist to the audience, and like an echo back again and again and again, back and forth, resonating through all of us in this beautiful community of hope and courage. I want to be a part of such a community, of such a world. I want to be in that play with you and see what we might co-create together in our dynamic subjectivity and our abundant possibility. Inspired by the words of my friend and colleague, the Reverend Bonnie Vijard, who is legally blind, may ours be a religion where people of all backgrounds and abilities, each of us, and those not in this room, no matter our level of sight or the speed of our movement, our ability to hear or the style of our learning, no matter the acute or chronic illnesses we may face or the fear or peace or combination of both we may feel around these topics this morning, where all of us within and beyond these sanctuary walls may feel not only that they can access such a space and community as this one, but that they too will become welcome and embraced for their wholeness and beauty. When we practice our breathing, when we gather and depart one another on Sunday or any day, may we remember we are neither alone in the crowd or on the stage, but one with each other and with all existence, a vision truly to behold on this glorious morning. May it be so. And amen.